I did also share the outline for today
Yep.
a little bit late yesterday evening. And yeah,
See, that's
so
the downside of sharing on Google Drive. I saw that you were editing until 12:04 a.m. That's not a good thing.
I meant it when I said I nerded out. It was a full on rabbit hole session, and suddenly it was midnight. Hello there. Welcome to the Good.Enough.Shrink podcast. We are your hosts. I am Jenna Chang, a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist practicing here in Los Angeles, California.
And I'm Dr. Patrick Kelly. I am also a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist practicing in the Los Angeles area.
We are on a mission to demystify child psychiatry and have conversations surrounding difficult topics on youth and adult mental health, but not without a little play along the way. Welcome back, or welcome if you're a first-time listener. So we want to continue the conversation from last time where we were talking mostly about history and the beginnings of child psychology. We talked about the orphan train movement, the child guidance movement, the juvenile justice system, and then focused on children specifically at the residential centers. So in the 1940s to 60s, this was really an abundant time for child and adult psychology. And around this time was this movement towards a humanistic approach to psychology, psychiatry. And one of the most influential people in this movement was Carl Rogers. He came up with the person-centered therapy and also this idea that you hold patients, clients in an unconditional positive regard. Some people make fun of Carl Rogers because he essentially is like extremely supportive, unwaveringly kind and accepting. But this is really important to highlight from an attachment perspective because attachment focused therapy is that support that you get when you're in your darkest times and you are just not yourself, that somebody still believes in your strengths despite your flaws. And that is incredibly healing.
So we'll talk more about attachment therapy and attachment trauma and different attachment styles. But one of the core ideas behind how kids attach is trust, that they have to trust the attachment object, that the attachment object will be there. And so in a break of attachment, or if somebody has an attachment trauma, the idea of finding a relationship or a person who is always there for you 100% of the time, who you can always trust with boundaries and limits, can be very healing. And that's where Carl Rogers, I think, was coming from, because it does sound like just be nice to everyone and they'll be healed. And that's not, it's much more complicated than that. And frankly, more interesting than that. Also, because one of the reasons why he pushes the unconditional, continual positive regard is that if somebody has attachment trauma, they will typically, without even realizing it, test that. And they will try to
Mm.
push people to make sure that they're trustworthy. So almost do things on purpose to try to trigger them or make them respond negatively. And so having the framework of always being supportive and unconditionally positive, even in the face of what happens in the session, is part of the deeper context of how he saw the healing process moving.
Yeah, so important. And he, along with Abraham Maslow, created this movement towards the humanistic approach. And Maslow is a little bit more mainstream. I think maybe people have heard of his hierarchy of needs. So you have sort of physiological needs, food, shelter, water. And then on top of that, you have the social bonding need, which includes a sense of belonging and a sense of secure attachment. And then you can explore deeper meanings of life that leads to self-actualization and all of these existential kind of questions. But you really can't explore that without a support network. So Donald Winnicott, also around this time in the 50s, was thinking about as Dr. Kelly mentioned last time, the good enough parent, good enough mother, and the transitional object. I wanted to focus a little more on the transitional object here because you can almost think of it as like an attachment object. The transitional object usually is a soft or plushy kind of item, maybe a teddy bear, maybe a blanket that 1 to 4 year olds have that represents the first not me object. So this essentially is a symbolic representation to a valued other, usually a mother or parent that links that beloved object in the external world to an internal representation of that object. And so it is a holding environment for the child to then have a sense of separateness from the external world, that they are a separate entity.
It's such an important concept to understand, especially as we're talking to children and trying to understand children, because everyone has the image of the kid with his blankie. Perhaps I'm dating myself, but of course, there's the famous Peanut character who always had his blankie, and there's the kid who always has their teddy bear, and both Dr. Chang and I have worked in the hospital, so even children in a hospital bed, their first question can be, "Where is Teddy? Where is whatever that object might be?" And I think it's hard as an adult to put yourself in that framework and to think about that because we've become better at relating to people. And so most of the time, with exceptions, objects are just objects. So we'll take the blanket and wash it, or we'll take the teddy bear and put it on a shelf. But that's because the internal representation and the physical object are so linked, any threat to the object threatens the internal representation. So throwing Teddy in the washer threatens death. It's terrifying
Mhm.
to a young child. So I think we can sometimes think kids are being dramatic or being cute when they become so distraught over the loss or threat to that object, but it's a real psychological process that's happening in the child's world, that they're learning how the world works and how things outside of them exist.
Yeah. Do not wash the teddy. Do not
Do
wash
not wash the teddy.
Right. Yeah. So, just a couple other people that I think are important to briefly mention. There was this focus again on thinking about psychology from a developmental perspective that comes in stages. And if you're not at a certain stage, you may not have been able to have fully met the past stages. And I think the chronological side of this, there's criticism surrounding that you can have stages at different points in your life. But essentially, Eric Erikson in the 1950s, he created the psychosocial stages of development. And what's really important, again, is that he highlighted the relational aspect and how important that is. And the very first stage is the trust and mistrust, how the child goes out into the world to determine whether they can trust something or not. And then later on, sort of in adolescence, early adulthood, you have an intimacy versus isolation stage where you decide, do you want to seek out intimacy or stay more or less in isolation to protect yourself? And Kohlberg, who was the person that came up with the moral stages of development, he also kind of jumped on the bandwagon with this and talked about social norms and how the interpersonal relationships can help children understand complicated concepts in the human experience, like ethics. You really can't understand ethics without understanding the intricacies of interpersonal relationships. So, in the backdrop of all these people in the 40s through the 60s coming up with the incorporation of the environment and the relationships that surround you and how important that is to child development, John Bowlby came up with three seminal works.
By the way, for context, we're going quickly through these people and their theories because for our purposes, it feeds into the concepts that we're talking about. But just like last time, if you're a medical student, a psychology student, if you're getting ready for boards, memorize these stages. You will have at least three questions on Eric Erikson and the stages of development and 40-year-old male is expressing this, that, or the other. Which stage of development are they stuck in? So,
Yes.
so pay attention to that.
Yes. Piaget, Erikson, Kohlberg, and Freud
Yep.
memorize them. So, Bowlby then, around that time, published three seminal works. And the first one is called The Nature of the Child's Ties to His Mother. This was 1958. And he proposed that attachment is actually a natural bond that is healthy, even in adulthood. And this was dramatically different from the psychoanalyst beliefs at the time, which basically talked about the child's ties to the mother mainly being libidinal and based on satisfaction and not so much function. So he turned around, Bowlby turned around and said, no, there's a functional aspect to this tie. He also challenged the social learning theory at the time, which was a presiding theory surrounding social behavior. And he argued that attachment was not a form of dependency that represented regression, but again, served a function.
I think today we take a lot of these concepts for granted. And almost when you're learning about Freudian concepts, they seem foreign and strange in a way. And almost salacious in a certain way that you're just attached to your mother or father because they bring you what you need and they bring you pleasure. What a selfish infant. But that there's a very healthy bonding and attachment that helps set the pattern for how you're going to have relationships with other people in the future and how to get your needs met, but also how to care about the other person. The reciprocality of it feels much more natural today because of people like John Bowlby, who unpacked some of that and really progressed beyond it. Not to say that, certainly not my place to say that one's correct or one's incorrect, but Bowlby is definitely more the type of way that we think about the attachment bond today,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
was radical at the time, which was a
Re-
total transformation.
yes, he was a rebel. He was a rebel. He pointed out that a lot of his theories came from the observation that there's a dramatic response in the child when the child is separated from the parent. And he just couldn't find a way to explain it with traditional theories. And he also stated that, there seems to be this pseudo independence, that some children seemed fine and could go on and play and seem like they didn't care that their parents were not around. However, this actually later on, in the 90s, they did research on these children who seemed to be a little more aloof, and they found that their cortisol level is just as high as a very anxiously attached child. And so back in the 60s, he started to realize there's something about this superficial indifference that was just not quite right. So John Bowlby had these great ideas, but he didn't really have ways to prove them. They were theories. And that's when Mary Ainsworth came along and she changed the whole game. She was inspired by James Robertson, who was originally working with John Bowlby and created the 2-year-old goes to hospital video through very naturalistic observations. Mary Ainsworth stressed the importance of nonverbal communication to determine security or insecurity. She was really awesome. I really just have so much respect for her. She went out and gathered data. She didn't stick to sort of one type of population either. She did the Uganda project where she saw 26 families with unwanted babies. And so that's interesting that she actually looked for parents who didn't want children, did 2-hour visits every 2 weeks for 9 months. She did that in Uganda. And then she came back to the States and did the Baltimore project where she then observed 26 white middle class infant parent pairs, very different from Uganda, 4-hour home visits 18 times over the course of a year. And she essentially summarized what she saw in hundreds and hundreds of hours of observation into a 20-minute experiment called The Strange Situation. Med students in residence.
Yep.
This is another very important concept to memorize for exams. But the strange situation had different tiers of distress for the infant. And it started with an infant and the mother in a room together playing. And the first level of distress was that there's a stranger that comes into the room. And we look at how the infant reacts. And the next level of distress is that the mother leaves the room and the infant is stuck with the stranger. And the last level of stress is that the stranger leaves the room and the infant is all alone. And then, after a couple of minutes, the mother returns and we observe the interaction between the infant and the mother.
This is the basis of attachment theory, is the results of this test. So pay attention. Highlight, footnote.
Yes. So when the mother returned, there were four ways that the infant responded. The securely attached infant was crying and in distress, but within a couple of minutes, they were consolable, calm, and then they went on to play once again and explore the world. The avoidant attachment infants were blasé about when the parent left the room, and they continued to be that way when the parent returned. And so there was this superficial indifference and again seemed unfazed. And so initially they thought, oh, these children were very independent and they seemed totally secure, but they really were not interacting with the parent in an affectionate way. They would sometimes push the parent away and continue on playing. But later on, there was a lot more research into the avoidant attachment style, which showed that their heart rate, cortisol level, and blood pressure were just as high as the other insecure infants. And so it truly was a mask of the internal distress that was happening. So that's the avoidant attachment style. And then the other kind of insecure attachment was the anxious or ambivalent attachment infants. These children oscillated between demanding affection, throwing a fit, screaming, crying, and then rejecting the parent. So they would slap the parent or have a full-blown tantrum and just inconsolable, portrayed as the infant seeking the mother, even if the mother was there. So there was this denial of what's actually happening in reality. They're sort of consumed by this internal understanding that the mother is not reliable. I'm going to continue to act out. And last type of attachment style is disorganized, called disorganized attachment. And this actually, I think, deserves its own episode. So I'm not going to go too much into it. But essentially, these infants were totally unpredictable. Sometimes they were dazed and just stared off. Sometimes they would cry and have severe, severe tantrums. And sometimes they would smile and seem to be happy, even though the parent was gone. And so it's this completely disorganized kind of way. So these observations showed that in the US, about 65% of infants were securely attached, 21% were avoidant, and 14% were anxious or ambivalent. And the same distribution was found actually when researchers looked at infants across the world. So this is generally our understanding, is that majority of kids are securely attached, but there's 15 to 20% that are insecure.
Which is so interesting because you would think that the numbers would be different in different environments, in different places, with different cultures, that there would be such a strong impact in how kids were raised, whether it's by single parents, communities, families. But it does seem that the numbers are fairly consistent. So you'll hear when we talk about this, especially in the past, especially in studies, that we're usually talking about the infant and the mother because that's how the studies were set up. That's generalizable now to different parent dyads or different rearing environments or different group homes, different places that children find an attachment object. And that tends to be how they learn the attachment style. So it doesn't have to be the mother, it doesn't have to be the father. It can be anyone who is that object of attachment. I think that sometimes, like Dr. Chang was saying, the bottom line can be misread as the moms are doing a bad job, which is causing attachment trauma, which is not true. That is not what we're trying to say. And in fact, what we're trying to say is that these styles of attachment tend to be fairly predictable regardless of the location, the area that people are raised in. But just to ground us in the difference between how these studies were done in the past, how they might have been done today, and so that people don't stop listening to this podcast because we're always blaming the mother, because that's not true.
Right, right. That's not true at all. The predictability of attachment styles across different cultures teach us that parents can have a significant impact on the child's likelihood of building a secure attachment style. And this is done by parents building a secure attachment style themselves. That way, the child will then internalize that security and take it with them and feel secure in the world that they explore.
So, after the strange situation was published, John Bowlby then went back and emphasized that there is actually a biological evolutionary function to attachment, serving as its own motivational system, subserving feeding and mating, that it's an entirely different and overarching system. He also talked about how there are two sources of fear for an infant, that one is the presence of danger. That seems pretty obvious, I think, for us. You see a mountain lion walking down the street, not a great situation. And also, the other source of fear is the absence of an attachment figure. If an attachment figure, however, is sensitive and reliable and not perfect, there's no such thing as perfect, but predictable and attuned to the flaws and strengths of the infant, then the self is valued and reliable. And so the attachment directly relates to the infant's development of the sense of self. If the attachment figure is frequently rejecting or dismissive, then the child fails to develop a sense of self as a separate entity. And then there is no individuation or differentiation or any sort of term that you want to use to describe that. But essentially, your self-worth is not there. He talked about the selective exclusion of information from awareness, such as those seen in the avoidant attachment style, is a defense. And this defense then can lead to some of the things that we deem as psychiatric conditions today, dissociation, repression, different forms of neuroticism that can come with that too, and somatic symptoms. So, it can have an effect on the nervous system. If you're suppressing your needs over and over again, your body keeps the score. And it will show it to you in the form of pain, aches, all kinds of dysfunctions in the physical body.
And that's a good relation to the body keeps the score and the idea of trauma and things that we consider PTSD now. And I think that's a big reason why this can be called attachment trauma, because humans are predictable. And in a way, whether you're an infant or an adult, a lot of us respond to trauma similarly and have ways that, whether they make sense or not, writ large, our bodies and brains try to keep ourselves safe. And sometimes the infant will choose to simply reject and not think about and not take in information that is too painful or too distressing, and will look numbed or hyper respond, just like adults will in certain different situations. So the attachment really syncs up very well, even from theories from the 1960s through the 80s, to how we think of very modern diagnostic criteria today.
Mm-hmm. And I think, just to kind of go off of that, this is why it's so important to not force talking about trauma before the person is ready, that it can be quite harmful. They can dissociate, they can have sort of out of body experiences that can itself be traumatic. And so attachment is very closely tied to trauma in that way, and very applicable.
And we'll
So,
have many more in-depth discussions about trauma and the treatment of trauma, because it is very important and very nuanced about how to do it well. And we do have evidence that poor trauma treatment can be worse than no trauma treatment because it
Mm.
can worsen the condition, not to make people afraid of it in that way, but that it has to be done very carefully. Same with attachment trauma.
Mhm. Yeah, so now we understand some of the history. We want to go into adult attachment because this is also quite relevant. So, adult attachment was inspired by this concept called the theory of mind, which has been around for a long, long time, really, since Rene Descartes in the 1500s to 1600s, rooted in philosophy. So, this is like way long ago that people realize knowing that other people have beliefs, desires, thoughts, and feelings that are different from ours is actually important. And it influenced people like Mary Main and Peter Fonagy. These are two people that were quite influential in adult attachment research. What's important about adult attachment for us is that we can help parents think about how their own experience shapes the way they interact with their children. And so,
And also, I think hopeful thing that Peter Fonagy really brought to the table was the idea that attachment is not something that happens in infancy and is fixed forever. And there's nothing you can do about it. There's an idea that this is still mutable and changeable, and every relation, every interaction can have a positive impact on someone's attachment at 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. It sort of opened up the world to the idea that you are not just the sum of what happened in the first few years of your life, that things can move and change and improve later in life too, which I still think is something that's not thought of enough. That when people talk about attachment theory, when we think of attachment theory, we're always thinking about just what happens in infanthood and then trying to sort of compensate for that for the rest of your life. But you can actually get into that and change attachment styles by paying attention to it.
absolutely. It's really a story of hope. And I think we forget that when we talk about attachment style media, the way they have portrayed it is that it's kind of something that you can't really help and it dooms you for life. It's not like that at all. In fact, it doesn't have to be a parent, it can be anybody that's committed and devoted, whether it's a therapist or a partner, a friend. It's really, really malleable, and I think it's really important to highlight that it's really a story of hope. So Mary Main started at UC Berkeley in the 1970s, and she focused on a little bit more of the internal models rather than the external behavior that Mary Ainsworth focused on. Ainsworth was much more observant of the how the child was interacting in the external world. But Mary Main actually went on to prove the second part of John Bowlby's theory, which was that a child's internal representation of the world is built by their interactions with the world around them, not sprung sort of strictly out of internal fantasies and as claimed by a psychoanalyst at the time. And so she thought deeply about how to really portray this and capture this in research. And she came up with the adult attachment interview, which are a series of questions that evoke memories of past attachment figures. And she actually paid more attention to the way that these questions were answered rather than the content. And so, in psychology and therapy, we focus quite a lot on the process, not so much the content. And she was kind of a pioneer in that. And I wanted to kind of read off some of the questions that she had just to give us an idea of what the adult attachment interview was about. And so she would ask, I'd like you to try to describe your relationship with your parents as a young child, starting as far back as you can remember. Or she would ask, give me 5 adjectives to describe your relationship with your mother or your relationship with your father during childhood. She would then also ask questions that marked different milestones in the childhood experience. So, for example, did you ever feel rejected as a child? When was the first time you felt that way? Were your parents ever threatening for discipline or even jokingly? And how did you feel? Did you experience a loss? And what was that like? So a lot of relational questions, experiential questions, again, not really focused on what's actually being said, but the pauses, the the volume of the voice, the way that the story is told, if it has a certain connotation, positive, negative, neutral. Those are the things that she focused on. And she developed the adult slash parent, because most of the people she interviewed were parents, attachment styles. And these are essentially kind of equivalent to the children's attachment styles of secure, avoidant, anxious, and disorganized. But for adults, she called them secure, dismissive. So a parent who's dismissive may then influence a child to become avoidant, and preoccupied parent may then influence a child to be anxious, and then disorganized, reflecting the disorganized child as well. And so the adult attachment interview classification of the parent attachment style predicted the strange situation classification of the child with 75% accuracy in regards to security versus insecurity. So this is pretty big. I feel like in psychology, psychiatry, whenever we see anything over 40%, it's like mind-boggling. It's a huge deal. And so, with this level of consistency in the secure versus insecure attachment style, she really highlighted the intergenerational transmission of attachment patterns, that this is a mutually serving paradigm. So, for example, a secure parent who's able to have a wide range of behavioral and affective repertoire can have flexibility, sensitivity, and responsiveness that doesn't take away the attention from the child, but it generates a sense of security that things can be chaotic, but we're okay. We're grounded. We're okay. We see reality as is, and we can continue to be curious. A dismissive and avoidant parent may successfully convey a sense of stability and coping in the way that they're superficially masking their distress, but they can then be invalidating and forceful for the child to be equally dismissive and avoidant of their own emotions. A preoccupied or anxious parent may be able to empathize with the child's distress and validate them, but then they may transfer their own fears, anxiety, mistrust, and inability to deal with the emotion. I actually think this is so prevalent that, a child will fall and scrape their knee and they start crying, and then they look at their parent and they are freaking out. And so suddenly it's not a 3-year-old's problem, it's an adult problem. And that's a real problem. And it's natural because as a parent, you want to protect your children, and that's your utmost priority all the time, 24/7. And yet there's this side that has a pretty big impact. So again, we just want to be aware of when those things are happening, that we can adapt. And lastly, a disorganized parent with unresolved issues, emotional trauma, sometimes depression, anxiety, addiction, psychosis, they may actually welcome the role inverting behavior of their own disorganized children because it actually fits their own emotional needs. That if my child is disorganized, of course I'm disorganized. And it can be kind of justifying in that way. And it's a self-perpetuating system. The important thing is that this is all unconscious. The hope is that by talking about this, we empower parents that if they can make sense of their own lives and become secure in who they are, it is one of the biggest gifts that you can give to your child. If you know what your triggers are and what your fears and sources of joy are, then you can model for your child that resilience that you carry with you.
I think that's a extremely important point. Everything you just said is an extremely important point. But the idea that these are both very understandable responses to stressful situations that any human has, parent or otherwise. and that their reflexes almost, that they happen so quickly. If you see your child fall, your first thing is to run over and grab them. Are you okay? Is everything all right? You don't have the time to think through, all right, in this situation, what is the best thing I can do to make sure that my child has a positive attachment style moving forward? You need to make sure that they're okay. So these are not none of this is meant to be criticism of parents or of their responses. Everything is studyable and examinable because it's so natural and because it just kind of happens. And that through understanding how we react and how we respond to different situations and focusing on ourselves, we can, by just doing that, potentially help our children. That sometimes being what feels like a little selfish and focusing on yourself can actually be the most positive thing you can do for your child's attachment and for the evolution of raising a positive adult. It's kind of the idea that we want to be the best we can so that we can model, so that we can care for, so that we have the capacity to be the best we can for our kid. And I think that I've certainly seen parents who feel like, I'll be okay, I'm strong, I can get through it, but I need to make sure that my child is okay. And
Mhm.
actually flipping that and making sure that you're okay first really does allow you to be the best caregiver you can for your child.
Mhm. Yes. Yes, if I could write self-care day on a prescription pad, I would do it all day. For parents, just you really deserve that. So the question then is, how do we become more secure in ourselves and our experience? And the answer is that it's hard. We have to do our own inner work. And Mary Main started this conversation on metacognition, or the ability to have a stance towards someone's mental experience without significant emotional attachment. And so you're thinking about a thinking or you're feeling about a feeling. And so, for example, this is the idea that, instead of saying, I'm a forgetful person, you're saying, I'm a person who often feels forgetful when she misses a deadline. So, this idea of having a little bit of distance from that emotion can have mitigating effects on unfavorable attachment experiences and even trauma. And Peter Fonagy in the 1980s, so this is, a couple of decades after initially John Bowlby proposing attachment theory, he took it a step further and focused on affect, serving as the basis of secure attachment. And he coined the term mentalization. This is the ability to consider that having a mind with affect mediates an experience. So, for example, a daughter can realize that she felt that her mother did not care for her because her mother felt rejected by her. And so there's a felt experience, and that in itself can be an objective thing to look at. And so, the question is the internal world and external world equated, decoupled, or separated? Your internal representation and the external reality can be the same. For example, I'm being treated badly because I am bad. That there's no really I, but only a me to which things happen to. So that is basis for insecurity and lack of trust in oneself. The internal representation and the external reality can be decoupled. And that means if something is happening to you, you are totally in denial. Maybe you're repressing, maybe you're dissociating. This actually also gives rise to the concept of narcissistic grandiosity, that you're completely rejecting what's happening in the external world because it threatens or imagined reality, and it's a way to protect ourselves.
It's similar to
Mhm.
what you were talking about with Mary Main, that it's observing the observer. It's sort of taking
Mhm.
a step back from your thoughts and your feelings and looking at that interaction between and differences between the internal world and what is objective.
Mhm. Exactly. Now, you can have a healthy, balanced way to approach internal representations and external reality which is called mentalization. Our internal world is separated but related to our external reality. So we can actually reflect on our thoughts, feelings, and fantasies and how they affect the external world and how the external world affects us and what happens to us. So we can then understand that there's a difference between factual events and our reactions, and that leads to an internal sense of freedom. And so mentalization, when it's appropriately done, can separate what's happening outside of you from how you're reacting inside of you. And there's a sense of liberation that you are not at the mercy of what happens to you.
It's a
This was a
really interesting and complicated concept, and Peter Fonagy uses it as a verb that people should mentalize, that you can learn to mentalize by observing the similarities and differences between the objective facts of what's happening outside and your participation in that, your response to that, and how your internal world reacts to that. So the idea that there's a porousness, that the external world and your internal world are identical, that you don't have an observing eye, that you are just a product of whatever happens in your environment, has a real powerlessness to it. And there's an idea that, well, this thing happened to me, therefore it defines me, therefore I am this thing, is fairly common, and it's something we see. And in a way, it allows you to escape any blame for your own actions or your own responses, but it also takes away any sense of control you have. The opposite of that, that the external world simply doesn't understand me, that I am the agent of my own destiny, and whatever happens outside of me doesn't influence or change that, can be the core of what in pop culture is almost delusional narcissism, that I'm the best thing in the world. The world just doesn't understand me yet. Everyone else in existence is wrong. I am correct because my world is right and the external world does not reflect that yet. The real trick is to see and appreciate and understand and not judge the difference between the two, but to use them both to understand how to take the next step. So instead of reacting, you respond. You get control over what happens next. You understand what's coming in towards you, and then you make a choice about what you do next, not driven by either, well, just a reflex. Well, the external world determines everything I do, so I just need to do the next thing, nor driven by the external world doesn't matter. I'm just going to do whatever I want to do and wait for it to catch up.
Yeah, this is the basis of empathy.
So if someone is rejecting you, you know that doesn't make you worthless. And if someone is praising you, you don't feel like you need it and you rely on that external validation to prove your sense of worth. And because you feel secure in yourself this way, you are then able to have empathy for others and think about where they might be coming from. Maybe they're projecting, maybe they feel insecure themselves. And so it gives you room to mentalize and empathize with others.
You're able to have this reflective capacity and put yourself in others' shoes. And that's why Peter Fonagy was so passionate about this concept that for parenting, it's very important to have the ability to mentalize and the ability to have empathy. And normally in development, children have mentalizing and reflective capacity around age 4. So the child is able to understand that their external world and internal world are neither equated or decoupled, but exist separately and have a relationship with each other. And so, kids are always so good at catching something that's not genuine. They just see right through it. They'll call you out in the room. And if you feel like your 6-year-old knows exactly what's going on, they probably do. So again, very important for parents to take care of themselves, because if you're not feeling well, children will absorb that like a sponge and they will want to take care of you. And that's fine to an extent, but we want to be aware and we want to catch that before it spirals. And so mentalization is really key for secure attachment parenting.
One thing that I think of as helpful is that children and infants are little architects that are building this internal world. And so if something happens, they hear a loud noise. Most, not all kids, and that this is a much more complicated discussion, but to keep it simple, will look to their parent and see how their parent's responding to it. Because is that noise terrifying? Is that noise funny? Is that noise, what does this external world mean to my internal world? And so that sort of mirroring and seeing how their parents react is a lot of how the process of transmitting your own responses into a child actually happen. This gets back to that we're not saying that parents are purposefully trying to make their kids anxious or sad or worried or attached or unattached. Kids are little sponges and they just suck up whatever they see. So if something happens and it's scary and you react by showing that it's scary, they will see that and they will pick up on it. This is not saying you have to control your response to everything that happens, but merely saying that the natural consequence of all of that is this is how kids learn. This is how kids learn to mentalize, is by watching how their parents mentalize.
Yeah, I'm reminded of Winnicott's quote. Again, Donald Winnicott always throwing in these wise quotes, but he said that the precursor of the mirror is the mother's face. And it's quite true that whatever emotions you feel in your heart and genuine space that you have with your parent is the beginning of the mirror that the child has to discover themselves. So that is to also say that it's so important to cherish play. Play is where kids feel safe and they can show their internal world without any sense of responsibility or maybe like ways that it can be jeopardized, like their internal world can be jeopardized, that it's an opportunity to explore the relationship between the internal and the external world. And so if you can play with your children in any capacity, that will be one of the most wonderful things that you can do to build that connection with your child. It shows them that you're there, that you're seeking connection, that you're attuned.
This is such a fascinating and expansive topic. I really enjoy talking about this. Just the idea of things that we've forgotten, how important play is. We think of play as almost a selfish activity or something that's not productive or doesn't make us better people or doesn't suit us, but that's how kids learn about the world and express their internal world and sort of put it up against reality and see how it works. So imaginative play can be really productive. So if you are worried that just hanging around playing with your kid is, self-indulgent or not effective, it's a really important part of the child development and the child moving forward. So you don't always have to sit down and do homework. It's just as important to sit down and do some fun stuff and play.
Yeah. And I also am thinking about, sometimes parents feel like, oh, they got to get them the latest Xbox or PS5 or the iPad. But really, it's not so much about that as much as you have relentless curiosity about how they see the world. I have families that enjoy playing with leaves and dirt and rocks, and you create this entire world with those items, and it's so rich with information, with personality, and so that if you don't have as much resources to play with, you can still very much cherish the play and learn a lot from them.
It's more enriching than Fortnite. Not to ding Fortnite, but to use it as an example of creating your own world is much more enriching than playing with a world that's already created.